Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Korg MS-20-V tutorial series. Today we're going to take our first of several looks at the patch panel. It's this section on the right hand side, and this is the means by which we can override the normal behavior that all of these hidden internal wirings give us out of the box, basically common defaults. If you're enjoying this video series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's a fantastic way to do that. Now, spoiler alert, today we're going to be predominantly dealing with this section of the patch panel here, plus one other control that we'll deal with eventually. And it's all to do with the modulation generator over here. And you can see mod generator, and we've got some patch points, these things are called. These sockets are called patch points. And what we can do is we can basically click in one of these patch points with our left mouse button. And now you can see all of these yellow lights light up, telling us all of the various locations that we can drop this cable. And when I do, I've created a patch from this output to this input. If I right click on either of those connections, I get rid of the cable. But I think the best way to approach the patch panel is to dive straight into examples and start seeing it in real world action. So I've got my completely standard default preset here, generating a really simple tone. I'm just going to switch it to a pulse. It's still nice and straightforward. There's nothing better than examples to demonstrate a concept. So what we're going to do is we're going to firstly play with the pitch modulation, and then we'll introduce the patch bay. So here's my tone, increase some pitch modulation and decrease the frequency down to about half a hertz. So it's basically completing one period of that modulation every 2 seconds. And what you're hearing there is a triangle wave. Now let's have a look at the modulation generator's waveform, because we've not really discussed this in detail yet, and we need to understand exactly what's going on here for today's purposes. At the moment it's generating a triangle wave because this knob is set to 12 o'clock, and this little symbol here is telling you that you've got a triangle wave. If I turn this waveform all the way anti-clockwise, we're going to get a sawtooth. And if I turn it fully clockwise, we're going to get an inverted sawtooth or ramp. Set it back to 12 o'clock. Now that's only one of 2 waveforms that this modulation generator is capable of outputting, and we've not even discussed the fact that it's also capable of generating pulse waves, and that's what we're going to do now, because on the outside of this legend you can see that we've got a square wave, a narrow pulse and a wide pulse, but we can't access it without using the patch panel. So here's the task, and we're going to accomplish it via the use of the patch panel. Instead of having this wave go up and down in a triangle form, we're going to change it to modulate using a square wave, which means it's going to be pitch number 1, pitch number 2, pitch number 1, pitch number 2. If we have a look at the pitch modulation knob, you can see that we've got normal connections, that's totally fine. But on the right hand side of this slash, we've got total external. This is the total patch point or socket of the patch panel. And you can see when I hover over it, it tells you which controls in the main synthesizer this socket or patch point is doing. I use those terms completely interchangeably. I'll try to use patch point for the purpose of today's video. If I pick this thing up, it now tells me all of the various connections that I can make, and one of them, connected to the mod generator, has the shape of a pulse wave underneath it. If I drop that cable in there, I've now set the modulation generator's pulse wave to modulate the pitch instead of its default triangle wave. And now the waveform knob on the modulation generator is going to modulate the width or the duty cycle of the waveform. So all the way anti-clockwise, it's high. The modulation is at its maximum for the maximum amount of time. If I actually pull it all the way down, you just get these kind of really tiny flicks. You never even hear the other tone. And on the other side of the fence, modulation's off for the majority of the time and on for a tiny amount of time. But at 12 o'clock, we've got a square wave. So we've overridden the normal behavior of the semi-modular synthesizer. using our patch panel, and now we're generating a square wave modulation of the pitch instead. Now there are two different ways that you can modulate pitch on the oscillators. The first knob is dealing with the modulation generator normaled connection, and that takes its alternative connection from this total socket or patch point, rats. But the second knob, the lower knob, which is normally connected to the envelope generator. So if I give myself, so EG1, here's my attack time. There's the envelope generator doing its business, but this time I've got a different label. So there's just the word external, we don't have total. And so this connection is coming from here. If I hover over the frequency knob, you can see the light up. So now I want to connect this patch point to the pulse wave generator. We get exactly the same behavior. Let's just have a review of that. I'm going to right click on the patch point to delete the cable, and we'll take an overview of what's just happened. So two normal behaviors of this synthesizer. We can mix any amount of envelope generated modulation with modulation generator generated modulation. That's a horrible sentence. To combine those two things together. So you heard the envelope having an effect on the pitch, and then the modulator having an effect on the pitch. Both of those controls can be overridden in the patch bay from two different locations for a sum effect. And you can have any combination of normaled and overridden controls in the same synthesizer operating simultaneously. So if I take a pulse wave connection out for the straightforward frequency modulation, which is the lower knob, let's just hear that on its own. But I leave the standard triangular waveform in control of the upper knob. Those two things will both operate simultaneously. So now we're going to get a little bit of triangular modulation from this control and a little bit of square wave modulation from that control. And it's pretty easy to identify those two different modulation types operating simultaneously. One's been overridden, one's normaled. Without even looking at any other controls on the patch panel, you're probably getting a bit of an inkling of just how many options are available to us here. The difference between normaled and overridden connection, and the fact that we can take these outputs and send them into so many different locations. It's going to give us an arbitrarily large number of permutations. This is where people use the word infinite and the internet goes crazy. Just throwing my preset away and getting back to my standard sawtooth default wave. Let's crank things up a little bit. I'm going to deal with this frequency input. So this is an input control, input patch point on the mod generator. I can tell that because when I click on it, I can only see outputs to connect to. And this is a means by which we can modulate the frequency of the modulation generator itself. Now, ordinarily, or normally, the modulation generator's frequency can be modulated using the envelope generator. So if I give myself a really big attack time and increase this modulation amount plenty, when I press a note, it's going to start off really slow. Oops, I need to dial the modulation amount in. It accelerates slowly over the course of the envelope generator's attack period, and then once it's up and running, it'll oscillate at whatever the frequency is set to, 4 Hz. Let's do it one more time. So there's the envelope generator, and then it gets up and running and cycles at 4 Hz. I'm going to pull this right down to 1 Hz. But I want to override envelope generator's control over the modulation generator's frequency and instead take control. You see when I hover over the knob, you can tell me which patch point in the patch panel is capable of overriding this behavior. So instead of being controlled by the envelope generator, instead I'm going to be controlled by the pitch of the note that I play. The way that I can do that is by using this patch point over here. It's called keyboard control voltage out. So if I press a very low note on the keyboard, it's going to generate a low modulation amount, and higher up it's going to generate a bigger one. So take a control and you can see it's now saying it's perfectly okay to drop this into the mod generator's frequency input. Now I'll press a low note on my keyboard. Even at this low note, even at this low pitch, it's still oscillating faster than 1 Hz. I'd have to go all the way down here. There's my 1 Hz wave. But the fact is that this note, you can see the key on the keyboard being represented. If I go up 2 octaves, much faster. It just gets faster and faster as I go up the keyboard. So the keyboard's pitch is being used as a control voltage to decide how fast the modulation generator is going to be. If I dial that control back a little bit to make it a little bit more sensible, you're still going to get the effect, just less of it. So here's my low note, here's my high note. So that's the frequency of the modulation generator being overridden, but now we can override the shape. So now if we take a patch from the pulse wave output, let's tie it into the pulse width modulation input. So pulse width modulation is over here. Normally we've got the control from the modulation generator. Now we're taking the control from whatever we're being fed by. And I want a pulse wave in order to be able to demonstrate this. So the speed of oscillation is being matched, the pulse width is matching the speed of the oscillator. When I go up an octave, pulse width modulation is tracking with the pitch of the key. So it's probably worth taking just a quiet moment of contemplation there to have a think about what's going on. There are 2 separate modulation effects because we've increased 2 different knobs, pitch modulation and pulse width modulation. The pitch modulation is still being modulated by the triangle wave of the modulation generator. Its normal connection hasn't been overridden. See, this knob's been turned up, it's modulation generator / total external. There's nothing connected to the total external patch point. So the pitch modulation that you're hearing is a triangle wave. But the pulse width modulation, coming from this knob over here, has been overridden. And so what you're hearing is, as the pitch is going up smoothly, the pulse width is being snapped tight, but the frequency of both of them is being controlled by the same modulation generator. For the final step in this example, I'm going to override the pitch modulation. I'm going to take that from the pulse wave output as well. So I click in the output socket. You see there's already a cable coming out of it, but when I click in the output socket, I'm generating a second cable now. This is called a multi. A multi is basically something that allows you to split a signal and send it in 2 different directions. So I'm going to take this pulse wave output, which is currently in square wave mode, and I'm going to send it to both the pulse width modulation and the total external modulation. And it is a little bit difficult to track because all of the cables are the same colour, unfortunately. The only way that you can really figure out what's going on is to pick the cable up and kind of drag it around, and then you can see where it's coming from. So as I'm dragging, you can see the graphical representation of these 2 sockets, these 2 patch points being connected into the same place. Let's hear what that sounds like. So now that's the pitch being violently oscillated, modulated up and down, and also the pulse width. If I slow the frequency right down as far as I can, you can see the pulse wave, the pulse width in the oscilloscope being basically narrowed. I think that'll do us for today. Cup of tea time. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit the like button, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.